Self-Help for Refugees is Lee recounting on sort of his experience as being an immigrant and the importance of assimilation, and specifically how not only can that assimilation, the process of assimilation, be difficult and tiresome and challenging, but the sort of importance that it has in sort of adhering to traditional norms of society. He sort of ends the poem on more of a positive note and sort of finding the positive parts of life and living in the moments. The intention of this is to sort of provide a mechanism for immigrants like himself and others to sort of thrive in a world dominated by racism, xenophobia, and sort of hatred towards people that don't look like them. He uses sort of a tone shift along with many metaphors throughout the poem to sort of display these as sort of a impact on me as a reader. It's something that I can understand as sort of understanding how immigration in this country particularly is such a polarized issue and is sort of stuck in an echo chamber of violence on one side, and on the other side calls for increasing the ability for people to come into the country. So the start of the poem is talking about if your name suggests, I think is particularly important because the typical understanding of someone from another country is that you just look at their name and then characterize them through that. I think it's a traditionally stereotypical way of identifying someone, and Lee is using that and sort of reappropriating that to understand those who sort of experience those very same forms of violence. I think that sort of suggesting of bells, the sort of bells that he has for entertainment or announcing seasons or birthdays of gods and demons, are sort of talking about the cultures that existed within China. We also have internal rhyme scheme of seasons and demons, which sort of show how there's like a permanence of bells that exists within China. Now he says that it's probably best to dress in plain clothes when you arrive to the United States. This is sort of the first hint of assimilation that we hear, sort of the importance of covering your culture and only making sure that you appear to be normal. And so what is frustrating with this aspect of it is that it's sort of you're only being judged on the outside. All you need to do to assimilate is to dress in plain clothing, which sort of shows that it's a very superficial way of judging people, not necessarily on what they are, but based on what they wear. Now, saying that try not to talk too loud is to not sort of gather a bunch of attention, but don't use your second language is, I think, sort of the meaning behind this one, is stick to sort of code switching and using whether it be English and such. So the next stanza is incredibly autobiographical, as sort of proven by the intense details and sort of the history of his father being persecuted by the Chinese government. What's important is that sort of he says that his mom buried him in the skirt folds, but then at the ends of the stanza he says sort of towards the sort of turning a child away from history. The history sort of shows that it's a significant moment in time, sort of the persecution that was taking place, and towards the place all human aching starts. He's talking about necessarily the womb, and when he says all human aching starts is sort of implying that life is not necessarily this process of love and happiness, but rather a sort of a process of continual pain, as in it starts from childhood and continues throughout that. So then in the next stanza, he starts talking about various people that you might meet along your journey, and I think it's interesting that he uses the rhetoric of adoption, because typically we think of adopting people from other countries, but now it's talking about adopted country, which is sort of a way that he plays with the understanding of what it means to even belong in a country in the first place, and sort of you believe, which means that you're being sort of tricked. It's not necessarily true. That you see others' face as open as a sky. This is sort of a metaphor, sort of being unbiased or unjudging, sort of a promise of a new beginning is the opportunity to share your new culture with them. When he says that you're probably standing too far away, I think that there's two potential meanings. An optimistic reading of this aspect of the poem would say that you should get closer and sort of enjoy what you can share with them, enjoy the sort of unbiased nature of them. But I think based off of the tone that he leads into this in, with things like a believe or sort of the nihilistic nature of human aching, I think that what it means is that when you actually get close to them, you'll realize that they are not who they seem to be and they are not as unbiased as you think. Now, in the next stanza, he sort of does the opposite, as sort of he's talking about when you meet someone whose first and last pages are missing, but the story of your own birthplace. He's talking about someone who who is like you, but part of their story is missing. You don't know exactly everything, but he talks about there is country twice erased, once by fire, and forgetfulness is sort of analogous to how China has been erased through things like violent revolutions, but also through sort of things like cultural revolutions that tried to purge the mind. And when he says that you're standing too close, I think what he means is that you're too close to the thing that you're trying to avoid. You're trying to avoid conversations about yourself, and that what you need to do instead is to be sort of formulating a new beginning. Now, the next stanza, when he sort of talks about burden, he's saying that you should try to move on. You should not dole in the sadness that you have of sort of forcing this assimilation. You should not force it onto someone else. It seems as if you should just move on. Now, the next stanza, he sort of continues the idea of assimilation and does it through a metaphor of like looking the other way, and sort of how one side of your face doesn't match the other, which is being mixed race and having that ability to assimilate. He's saying that those in the past did it to be successful, so you should specifically do it. And the rhetoric of not being beautiful means that on the outside you may not be able to sort of adhere to their systems of beauty, but you should still sort of try to assimilate yourself in ways that make sense. Now, he says that you should get used to seeing while not seeing. What this means here is that you should sort of get used to not being able to understand, and sort of get busy remembering while forgetting. And sort of what that means is that you're trying to forget your past, but in order to do that, you must necessarily, in order to forget your past, you must at the same time think about it and sort of what is occurring. And when he says dying to live, not wanting to go on, I think that he means sort of that you're trying to live so hard, you're facing all these forms of violence that exist within your life, yet it is so hard you don't necessarily even want to continue. Now, he says that it's very likely that your ancestors decorated bells of every shape and size. It says that they're creating sort of these elaborate crafts and diagrams and calendars or star systems, yet these are very interesting and neat, but they don't necessarily provide any help for these immigrants who need to understand how to deal with the violence of the immigration system. And sort of the metaphor as a map is sort of interesting, because descendants are scattered all over the place, but they need a map, or sort of instructions or details of how to sort of thrive in the world that they're living in. Now, he then goes back to the situation that he had at the beginning, which is the relationship, the scene of his mother and father when he's getting on the truck, and he says that it seems as if it's a sense of regret where he isn't able to understand the language that his father spoke to his mother, and maybe it's because he's necessarily forgetting Chinese or sort of assimilating his culture, which he potentially feels bad about. Now, when he says, let the boy see, this is sort of a callback to the father's tough love, wanting him to see the facts, wanting him to see the history and understand sort of the significance, but he potentially might sort of disagree with this and say that you should sort of hide that culture. Now, the next stanza, he kind of justifies his forgetting about the language not used at home, or that it was forbidden, or that there were too many loud noises going on, which justifies sort of his assimilation. It's something that's very difficult. It's sort of losing a culture is losing sort of a part of oneself, so it's not something that's easy to do. Then, right before he says it doesn't matter, we have a break, and I think that this is where there's a major tone shift within the poem, because he says that the kingdom of heaven is good, but earth is better, which is sort of saying that even if it's not perfect, you should sort of adhere to what you can be, sort of suck it up and live within the now. Saying things like thinking is good, but living is better proves that sort of the way that you can live is the best way that you can have, and you should sort of accept the reality that you're sort of dealt. And sort of he says alone in your favorite chair is good, sort of that's the internal reflection on what is happening, but spooning is better, and what that means is it sort of elevates the role of relationships, which is sort of the motif that we see in many of his poems, and sort of showing how important and possible it is to live a happy life.